Long before alliances, promises, or ceremonies, there was another type of union, a union without words, but full of meaning. Between fires lit against the icy cold and dark caves used as shelters, the Neanderthals sought more than food and shelter. For a long time, we have imagined Neanderthals as brutes. They sought company, and within their own species, they discovered ways to conquer, attract, and bind to their partners. Rude, aggressive beings, incapable of any refined emotion. This includes, of course, affective and sexual relations. But how did they get closer? How did a Neanderthal conquer his partner? There was no formal language. Words were not developed as they are today, but there were gestures, facial expressions, postures, and sounds. When we observe the remains left by this species, fossils, tools, ornaments, and even bacteria, we begin to understand that the conquest between Neanderthals was not a violent and isolated act. Fossil records show that, many times, young females left their group of origin when they reached maturity, joining other clans where they formed new bonds with local males. This system, also observed in current primates, favored genetic diversity and prevented the accumulation of consanguinity. The selection of partners probably involved a combination of strength, ability, and social sensitivity, and the bond created with the new partner was, many times, the only network of protection it would have. They took care of the children, but they also knew how to hunt, collect, and manufacture tools. And their presence was, many times, what kept the group together, especially in the long winters of glacial Europe. There were no houses, no privacy, no division between romance and survival. Everything was part of the same effort, resisting a world that did not forgive weaknesses. In many cases, there are signs of stable cohabitation, with skeletons found together, close to tools and remains of shared meals. Coexistence, even without spoken language, seemed to be built around gestures. This prolonged care required mutual support. The partner hunted, protected, separated predators, and shared food. But this image is falling behind. Archaeological excavations, genetic analysis, and comparative behavior studies are revealing something deeper. There are no records of cradles or toys, but there was the most essential thing: time, presence, and physical contact, an ancestral gesture that we still do thousands of years later. The notion of family among Neanderthals was perhaps rudimentary, but not absent. Small groups lived close together, sharing tasks. The difficulties were immense. Simple gestures, but that, in the context of prehistory, spoke more than any word. There are traces of collective care, of cubs raised by more than one adult, of old people who survived, years beyond what the body would allow, alone. All this would only be possible with bonds of protection and affection between the members of the group. In periods of scarcity or displacement of groups, it was common for males to compete for fertile females, especially when there were few available. And what happened when a male tried to take the partner of another? The answer, almost always, was conflict. And when a child was born, the link between the couple deepened. The acceptance of the female itself, her choice, also weighed. Over time, the gesture became a routine. The Neanderthals were able to create lasting social bonds, take care of their companions, and form stable families. It was part of a more complex social structure, where the bonds between male and female could last for years, perhaps for a lifetime, not by territory, but by status, food, or partners. Every gesture of care, every split skin, every shared shelter was an act of resistance. And in the end, isn't that exactly what we still do? Because to love, in the most essential sense, is not to say it is to remain. This story made you see the Neanderthals. With other eyes, imagine how many forgotten forms of affection are still buried under the ground. When a male from outside approached a female already integrated into the group, the tension was inevitable. If you believe that understanding the past is understanding what makes us human, subscribe. Until the next discovery, communication was primitive but effective. A look kept for longer. A food offer. But that is exactly why the bonds needed to be strong. A divided couple could die. This dynamic shows that effective relationships between Neanderthals were not imposed blindly. The groups became smaller, reproduction became more difficult, and the consanguinity began to leave marks. There was dispute, yes, but there was also choice, rejection, protection, and permanence. They continued to raise their children. She did carry children. But she also built the tools, helped in the hunt for small animals, recognized edible plants, and kept the shelters organized. It was common for the youngest females to leave their original group and be integrated with others, which renewed the bonds and strengthened the communities. In some of these exchanges, perhaps feelings arose. The couples shared everything, from the meat of the day to the silence of the cold nights. A long absence could cause concern. A death, silent sadness. The loss of a partner could mean the collapse of a small group, or the isolation of a female with children, still small, condemned to hunger. A language made of shared warmth, mutual survival, and permanence. There, under the dim light of a bonfire, two Neanderthals may never have said, "I love you," but a silent look and a meat shared in the middle of the darkness could mean exactly that. But there are also indications that the physical appearance and the use of ornaments, such as toothpastes, shells, or pigments, could work as forms of attractiveness, not out of vanity, but as symbols of competence, care, and connection. A shared shelter, small signs indicating openness and intention. Neanderthals, who knew how to hunt, share resources, and protect the group, were more valued. Therefore, the choice of partner was not random. The hostile environment in which they lived required collaboration. A united couple meant more chances of survival for both and for their children. It involved perception, adaptation, and to a certain degree of emotional affinity, even without words. But it required courage. A young Neanderthal, when leaving, did not know who she would find. The courtship could start with gestures of collaboration, sharing fresh meat, giving shelter on stormy days, sharing a piece of dry skin to protect itself from the wind. The bond, a small family nucleus. It was in this context that partners emerged, not as subordinate figures, but as central elements for the group's survival. Love, as we understand it today, perhaps did not exist in the romantic form, but it existed in another language. Once the pair was formed, the life between two Neanderthals became marked by intense cooperation. The Neanderthal woman was not a secondary figure. The link between male and female was the core of Neanderthal life, and fossil evidence suggests that these unions could last for years, perhaps even being monogamous for long periods. A brief touch on the arm, a food offered, a warning look in the face of danger. Isotopic studies showed that Neanderthal babies were breastfed for about 9 months and began to defecate around 14. The partner warmed up, fed, and kept the baby alive. It is likely that parents slept close to their children, touching their skins to keep warm, singing or murmuring repetitive sounds to calm them down. The extreme cold, the scarcity, the predators, the diseases, a united couple had more chances to survive and their children to grow up. When the number of individuals grew, there was a need for redistribution, for new pairs, for movement. Not as we understand them today, but in the form of attachment, of emotional need, of felt presence. And yet, there are fossils that suggest something else. And of course, between the couples, these bonds did not leave words, but traces. Not all bonds between Neanderthals were peaceful. The world they lived in was unstable, and relationships, like everything around them, could also be threatened. Neanderthals were physically powerful. Their disputes could be brutal. Skull fractures, strokes with stone objects, and other signs of trauma were found in fossils, and many of them seemed to originate in fights between individuals of the same species. There were attempts to expel physical threats, and, in some cases, direct confrontations. Not always the most aggressive one. In certain contexts, she could refuse approaches or migrate to another group at her own will. In the last centuries of their existence, Neanderthals faced an increasingly cold, fragmented, and lonely world. Deformed bones, poorly formed teeth, exhausted bodies, but even so, until the last known records, they continued to form pairs. They continued to share heat and food. Until the end, they did not stop looking for company. And perhaps this is the most revealing. The bond between two Neanderthals was not just a reproductive instinct. It was a way to keep the flame of the species alive. They did not leave love letters, but left skeletons of curved mothers over children. Teeth spent chewing food for others, tools made to hunt not only for oneself, but for the other. Here on the Origin Primitiva channel, prehistory is not silence. It is living memory. It is care that has gone through millennia.